Thanks, guys, for inviting me. And I'm going to start sharing my screen because I want to start talking right away about my books and one book in particular. But let's start with this. So I have written more than 25 books. That's a lot of writing, and I'm very proud of the writing that I do, and I'm very passionate about the writing that I do. And the books that I have written focus on a particular time in history. I write about the time leading up to and during the Second World War and the Holocaust. And I know that some of you are very young out there. I hope that you will have heard of the Holocaust. That's something, if you don't know a lot about it now, you will learn more about it as you get older and get into other grades. But that's the period of time that I write about. So that took place a long time ago. Back in 1939 is when the Second World War began. The Second World War began when Germany invaded Poland. And at that time, Germany was led by a man who was considered to be quite evil. I really hope that most of you know his name. His name was Adolf Hitler. And one of the goals that Adolf Hitler had in mind, one of the things that he set out to do, was to rid the world of all Jewish people. If you can imagine, he believed that Jewish people were to blame for many of the problems that Germany was experiencing at that time so many years ago. So I write about that very real time in history. I also write about real places in history. So all of my books are set in the many countries that were involved in the Second World War. So this is a map of Europe, the continent across the ocean. And these are the boundaries of all these countries have changed. The names of some of them have changed over the years. But this is what Europe looked like in 1939 when the Second World War was beginning. And there you can see Germany and Poland right in the center of this map. That's where the Second World War was beginning. And all of the countries that you see here are the settings for the many books that I've written. So real time in history that I write about, real places in history, and I'm also writing about real people in history. And the people that I write about, for the most part, are people who were lucky enough to survive, Jewish people who were survivors of the Holocaust. And here you can see the photographs of some of the people that I've interviewed for the many books that I've written. The faces, I feel so privileged because I've interviewed, I think, maybe more than 100 Jewish survivors of the Holocaust for these books. But if you look at this group of photographs, you can see, first of all, that everybody's pretty young in these pictures. They're all children. These pictures are old, and you can tell that, of course, because they're black and white. But of course, it's important to know that the survivors of the Holocaust are no longer children that you see here. They're parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. But these are the stories that I write at the time that they were quite young and really desperate to survive. So real time in history, real places in history, real people in history, that is the writing that I do. So of course, everybody asks me, why do I write so many books about the Holocaust? 25 books, all of them set during this time in history. And the answer, of course, is that this is very real, personal family history for me. Both of my parents were survivors of the Holocaust. They were among the lucky ones to survive. And when I was young, they were very open with me about their survival experiences. Not all survivors can talk openly about that time in history, but I grew up in a family that did talk. And I grew up passionate about this history and determined that one day I would write about it, and one day I would try to pass it on to young people like the young people who are here this evening. And I knew that when I started writing, the first book that I wanted to write was a book about my mother, whose name was Gabby. So my mother, when she was just a young girl living in the country that was once called Czechoslovakia, she was forced to hide in a dresser, a cabinet that stood in her mother's dining room. My grandmother, my mother's mother, held the key to that dresser in her hand, and she held the key so tightly that after the soldiers had left, and my mother, Gabby, had climbed safely out of that dresser, when my grandmother opened her hand, her palm was actually bleeding from the indentation that key had made. That's how tightly she clutched that key, and that's how terrified she must have been for her daughter's safety. So I'm going to read you a little section. So that story of how my mother hid in that dresser became my very first book. There you see it, a book called The Secret of Gabby's Dresser. And I'm going to read you a little section from The Secret of Gabby's Dresser. I love reading my stories out loud, and I hope after you hear this, many of you will want to read the whole book. So at this point in the story, Gabby's family has received word that Gabby's in danger of being arrested and taken away from her family. The soldiers of Adolf Hitler, they were called the Nazi soldiers, were arresting young girls of about Gabby's age. They said that they were going to take them to factories, to work in factories making uniforms for the Nazi soldiers. But everybody was afraid that these young girls would be taken from those factories and eventually taken to the concentration camps. Those were the many prisons that Adolf Hitler had established at that time to imprison the Jewish people of Europe. So Gabby's family was actually warned that the soldiers were coming. And they were warned by a neighbor. The neighbor happened to be the mother of one of Gabby's really good friends. And the good friend's name was Marischka. So Marischka's mother came to the house to warn Gabby's family, Gabby and her mother, that the soldiers were coming looking for Gabby. So I'm going to read you this section. I'm going to leave this slide up because in this picture you can actually see Gabby. That's my mother, that beautiful picture of my mother right there in the center of the screen. And you can see a picture of my grandmother right there on the right. I love that picture of my grandmother when she was just a young mother and a very beautiful woman, and of course a very courageous woman. So remember, they've just been warned that the soldiers are coming by Marischka's mother, and this is what happens. "I'd better go now," said Marischka's mother. "I've been away long enough and my family will worry. God bless you both. Be well and stay strong." Mama closed the door behind her, and we watched through the window as she walked quickly down the street. I was in a daze, with confusing thoughts swirling through my head. Mama's face looked worn and weary as she turned to face me. "Gabby, it's time to make plans for your safety," she began. "Mama, it's not just my safety we need to worry about. It's our safety." "Yes, but you heard Marischka's mother. I know you won't want to hear this, but I've been thinking. You remember the Kos family who used to work on our farm?" So that was a family that worked on the farm working for Gabby's mother. "They live up in the mountains now. They are Christians and they're good people. When they stopped working here, they said that if there was ever some way they could help us, we only had to ask. They loved your papa very much, and they're not afraid of what might happen to them if they help Jews. I think you should go and stay with them. You'll be safer there." "Go away? Mama, how can you even think of such a thing?" I was so horrified I could barely speak. "Don't look at me that way, Gabby. It will only be for a short time, until all this trouble passes." "Mama, I won't go," I shouted. "Please, please don't send me away. How could I leave you? How can you think of separating us?" My mother turned her head away so she didn't have to watch the tears streaming down my cheeks. All I could think about was what my papa had said to me at night. We would be safe as long as we were together. How could I possibly be brave and strong when Papa had left me and now Mama was threatening to do the same? No, under no circumstances would I leave without my mother. "I don't know what else to do to keep you safe," Gabby, Mama whispered. "If the soldiers come looking for you, there's nowhere here for you to hide. I'm safest with you, Mama, I'm sure of it. And there are plenty of places I could hide in this house," I said desperately, looking around. "I could hide in a closet or in the basement or even in the dresser." "The dresser?" She looked doubtful. "Of course! What better hiding place? We could take out the shelf in the middle to make room for me. There's even a lock. No one would ever think of looking in there." I knew I was grasping at straws, but I had to have a plan. I was sure I'd be safe hiding in the dresser. Besides, I couldn't believe I'd ever need to. Not here. Not in our home. "The dresser," she said again. "We would have to take all the things out of there and put them safely away somewhere to make room for you." "Of course," I replied, hugging her. I knew I had won. I was sure I'd never have to hide in the dresser. What was important was that I wouldn't be sent away. I would stay here with Mama. "We'll take everything out. We'll get it all ready. But promise me you won't send me away." My mother hugged me back tightly. "All right, Gabby, you win. You can stay here. But we'll prepare the dresser in case we need it, and I pray it will keep you safe." And I'm going to stop there. So remember, I mentioned in that story Gabby's father, Papa. So what you need to know is that Gabby's father died before the war began, so he wasn't actually there when Gabby hid in the dresser. But I will tell you this, Gabby's father plays a really important part in this story. He certainly plays an important part in Gabby's life when he was still alive, and he continues to play a very important part in the story even after he died. But I'm not going to tell you how that is. You're going to have to read the book to find out. But I will tell you this, Gabby's story didn't end with her hiding in the dresser. Eventually, my family had to leave their home and find a safe place to hide as a family. They ended up climbing to a small mountain village north of where they were living. And it was there that they hid in the hayloft of a barn that was owned by a Catholic farmer and his wife. And they hid in that barn for a year and a half until the war ended. And that story of how my family hid in that barn became the sequel to The Secret of Gabby's Dresser, a book called The Night Spies. So that's all I'm going to tell you about the Night Spies. You're going to have to read that one as well. I just want to show you this collection of books that some of you may be interested in. And I hope you have some questions for me after this. Questions about writing, questions about any of my books. I'll just tell you this much about all of these books. These books are all about heroic people, just like that farmer who hid my family in his barn. Heroic people who helped Jewish people during the Second World War and the Holocaust. I love writing about people who demonstrated that kind of moral courage at that very dangerous time in history. And each one of these books focuses on a brave individual who helped Jews during the Second World War. So I really hope you get a chance to read The Secret of Gabby's Dresser, The Night Spies, or any one of the books on this screen, or any one of the books that I've written. So I'm going to stop sharing there and see if maybe some of you have some questions for me. I hope you have some questions. I know there are some writers in the room. So does anybody have a question? That's Yael. Do you want to unmute yourself, Yael?
Did you illustrate the books?
Okay, the question is, did I illustrate the books? Thanks for that question. Most of my books don't have illustrations inside the books, but there would be like an illustration on the cover, like this one. And I don't do any of those illustrations. I wish I could draw. Boy, do I ever wish I could draw. I'm so envious of everybody who can draw like this. But these are other people who get to draw the covers of my books, not me. Eva, you've got your hand up, I see. Do you want to unmute yourself?
How many books have you wrote?
I have written more than 25 books, and I am so proud of each and every one of them. That's a lot of books, isn't it? That's a lot of writing that I do. So I love writing, and I love every single one of the books that I've written. Casey, you've got your hand up.
Also, my mommy is a writer.
She is. Do I know your mommy?
No.
No. Do you want to be a writer?
Well, when I grow up, I want to be a vet, an artist, and a scientist.
Wow. Those are wonderful things to aspire to, wonderful careers. I hope you achieve every single one of them.
But first, I need to get you some dogs.
First you need to get some dogs, is that what you said?
Oh, first I need to get used to dogs.
Oh, I see, get used to dogs. Yes, that's a good start. I think that would be a good place to start. Anybody else have a question?
Ezra has his hand up.
Oh, Ezra, I don't see you. Oh, there, Ezra. Yes, Ezra, go ahead.
How old was Gabby then?
So Gabby was about 16 in real life when she hid in the dresser. In the book, I made her a little bit younger, so she's only about 14 in the book. You know, these books are what we call, of course, historical fiction, right? So historical fiction means you take a bunch of real stuff and you take a bunch of stuff that you can make up and kind of combine them into something that becomes a book. So I decided that I wanted to make Gabby a little bit younger for this book, but in real life she was about 16. It's a good question. Who else has a question? Something about writing, something about one of my books, something about Gabby's story. I'll tell you this. Sorry, were you going to say something, Ellie? So I'll just tell you this one thing. When I was about your age, so people sometimes ask me when I started writing. And the answer to that question is when I was about your age, it's not like I was writing books when I was your age, but I was writing just about everything else. I wrote poetry, really bad poetry, but I wrote poetry, I wrote songs, I wrote stories about people who I knew. I even wrote a comic strip. Remember, I can't draw. I said that to Eva. Oh no, I said that to Yael. I think I can't draw. But I still created a comic strip with little stick figures that would move around the pages. I kept a journal that I wrote in all the time. I still have some of my journals that I wrote in when I was about your age. And so I think I loved writing so much that I just knew at some point I would start turning the stories that I loved or the ideas that I had in my head, I would start turning them into books, which is what I did. And because I grew up listening to stories about this time in history, this was a time that I felt was really important to write about. And that's how I really began my whole writing career. Ezra, did you have another question? Is your hand still up? No, it just.
No, I accidentally left my hand up.
Okay, okay.
Well, I think that is a great jumping off point for our more interactive activity, but I want to take this time to thank Kathy for joining us. I think Kathy's going to head out now, but it was so great to hear from her book and to hear how she became an author. And I think everyone, we can give a big wave or a big clap to say bye-bye to Kathy for now.